No town would marry the bride with no memory, until an old doctor said, "Then we'll make new ones." The bag was the first thing I reached for. 40 years a doctor, and that's the truth of it. Somebody screams down the street, and my hand goes for the bag before my brain's caught up to what's happening. I had it off the peg and halfway out the door before I even saw her good. She was lying in the dirt at the edge of Hannity's grain lot, where the spur line cuts close to town, and Holly's Granger was standing over her like a man who'd found a dead dog and didn't know whether to bury it or report it. "Train must have slowed for the water tower," he said. "She just fell off, Doc, or jumped. I don't know which." I didn't ask him to guess twice. I got down on my knees in clothes I just had washed and put my hand under her jaw to feel for a pulse, and it was there, quick and thin, like a bird's. No blood that I could see. A knot coming up on the back of her skull the size of a walnut. Boots that didn't fit her, a man's boots, 2 sizes too big, laced with twine instead of leather. That's the kind of detail that tells you more than a face does. A face can lie. Boots laced with twine don't. I had Holly's carry her careful, mind the head, back to my house, which is also my office, which is also, since Margaret passed, just about the only place in this town where my name still means something. I'd been Doc Tar to Carver's Gulch for 31 years. I'd pulled half the children in this county into the world and closed the eyes of most of their grandparents. But somewhere in the last 5 years or so, since my hands started shaking some in the cold mornings, since my hair went the color of old rope, folks had started saying the old doctor instead of just the doctor. Like there was a new one coming any day now to take over, though there wasn't, and everybody knew there wasn't, and they said it anyway. I'm 63. I want that said plain because it matters to what comes after. I'm not an old man in the way men get old in stories, all wisdom and quiet dignity. I'm just a man whose knees ache when rain's coming, who still does the work because the work is what's left. She didn't wake for 2 days. I'll tell you about those 2 days because they're where it started, though I didn't know it at the time. You don't know when a thing starts. You only know later, looking back, where the seam is. I sat with her the first night because head wounds are unpredictable, and I didn't trust anyone else to watch for the signs, the unequal pupils, the vomiting, the speech that comes out wrong. I'd seen a miner's son die of a fall from a hayloft once, walked around talking sense for 6 hours, and then just stopped breathing in his sleep, and I never forgave myself for not sitting up with him. So I sat up with her instead, in the chair by the window where Margaret used to do her mending, and I watched this stranger breathe. She had brown hair gone dark with sweat and dirt, cut shorter than fashion allowed, like it had been hacked at with a knife rather than shaped by scissors. Hands rough enough to have done real work, not the hands of a saloon girl or a banker's wife. A scar along one forearm, old, healed white, the kind you get from barbed wire or a blade, I couldn't say which. No wedding ring, no jewelry at all. Nothing in her boots or her dress pockets to say who she was, no letter, no coin with initials scratched in it, nothing. When she did wake on the 3rd morning, with the light coming up gray through the curtains, the first thing she did was reach up and touch the bandage on her head, and the second thing she did was look at me with an expression I'd seen plenty of times in my work but never quite like this. Not pain, not fear even, not exactly. Something closer to a blank wall where a person's history should be. "Where am I?" she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. "Carver's Gulch, my office. You took a fall off the train, near as we can tell." "Whose train?" "I don't know. Holly's found you by the spur line." She was quiet a moment, looking at the ceiling like the answer might be written there. Then she said, "What's my name?" I'd treated men with battle wounds who lost memory of the battle itself. Soldiers who couldn't say what regiment they'd served with, what year it was, sometimes their own birth date. I'd never treated a woman who didn't know her own name, and there is a particular kind of stillness that comes over a room when a question like that gets asked in earnest and not as a riddle. "I don't know that either," I said. "Nobody's come looking yet, nothing on you to say." She closed her eyes, not crying, just closing them the way you close a door you don't want to walk through twice. "Then I suppose you'll have to call me something," she said, "until I remember the right one." I thought about it longer than the moment probably called for. "Sarah," I said finally. "My sister's name. She passed young. I always liked it and never had cause to use it again." She opened her eyes and looked at me, and there was the faintest thing in her face, not quite a smile, more like the idea of one passing through a room before the lamps even lit. "Sarah," she said, trying it the way you try on a coat that isn't yours. "All right." That's how she got her name. I want to be honest that I gave it to her partly out of practicality and partly because I liked having a reason to say it. Word travels in a town like Carver's Gulch the way grease fire travels in a dry kitchen fast, and there's no putting it out once it's caught. By the end of that first week, everybody from the mercantile to the church knew there was a woman with no memory living at Doc Tar's, and everybody had a theory. She was running from a husband who beat her. She'd done something terrible back wherever she came from, and the memory loss was a convenient story. She was simple in the head and always had been. She was a confidence woman working some long con on a foolish old widower doctor who didn't know any better. That last one stung worse than I let on. Hester Calloway, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the keeper of the town's moral ledger, came by on the pretense of bringing soup and stayed 40 minutes asking questions designed to look like concern. And she remembers nothing at all, Elias. Not even a town she was raised in, a man's name she might call out in her sleep. Nothing, Hester. It does seem awful convenient. It's not convenient for her, I said. Try it sometime. Try not knowing if you've got a mother somewhere worrying after you, or a husband who'll come looking with a gun, or a debt you owe, or a crime you committed. See how convenient it feels. She didn't have an answer for that, which I took some grim satisfaction in, though I knew it wouldn't end the talk. It only ever slowed it. Sarah herself didn't go out much those first weeks, partly because the knot on her head was still healing, partly, I think, because she could feel the way the town's eyes went to her like she was a stray dog that might bite. She helped around the house instead. Turned out whatever she'd been before the train, before the dark behind her eyes, she had a steady hand and a quick mind for organizing a chaos of bottles and instruments that I'd let go to seed since Margaret passed. She relabeled my whole apothecary cabinet in a week, sorted by what each tincture did rather than alphabetically the way I'd had it, which made considerably more sense, and which I was too proud at first to admit. "You've done this work before," I said to her one evening, watching her measure out laudanum with hands that didn't shake the way mine did anymore. "I don't know that I have." "Your hands know it even if you don't." She looked down at her hands like they belonged to somebody else. "That's an unsettling thought, Doctor." "Call me Elias," I said. "Everybody else in this town's decided I'm too old for a first name, but you didn't know me before, so you've got no reason to think of me that way." She did smile then, the real thing this time, small but real. "Elias," she said, and went back to her measuring. "I want to tell you I didn't think anything of it. That would be a lie, and I've spent my whole life telling people hard truths to their faces. I'm not going to start lying to whoever's listening to this now." I thought about that smile a good deal more than a man my age, with my history, had any business thinking about a woman's smile. Here's where I have to tell about Margaret, because you can't understand the rest without it. I married her when I was 26 and she was 22, and we had 18 years together before the fever took her. No children, we tried, lost 2 before they came to term, and after the second one, the doctor and me understood things the husband and me didn't want to accept, and we made our peace with it being just the 2 of us. 18 years is a long time to build a life with someone. It's a long time to learn the exact way she liked her coffee and the precise tone of voice that meant she was teasing versus the one that meant she was actually angry. And then to have all that knowledge turn instantly useless the day she stopped breathing. That was 11 years ago now. I'd been alone in this house 11 years, and I'd told myself, told the town, told anyone who asked with that particular look people get when they're fishing for whether a widower's available, that I was content, that the work was enough, that a man my age with my history didn't need to go chasing after what he'd already had and lost. I believed it too, right up until a woman with no name fell off a train into my life and started reorganizing my medicine cabinet and smiling at me like I was still a man worth smiling at. The trouble started in earnest about 6 weeks in, when a man came asking after her. He rode in on a lathered horse, just 2 days old on his coat, and went straight to the sheriff's office before he ever came near mine, which should have told me something about his character right there. A man looking for his lost wife generally goes to the wife first, not the law. His name was Garrett Voss. He said Sarah was his sister, that her real name was Beatrice, that she'd run off from their family spread 3 counties over after a disagreement, and he'd been searching for her since. Sheriff Dolly brought him by my house himself, which I understood. A man claiming kin has a claim that has to be looked at, whatever I thought of him on sight. Sarah was in the kitchen when they came in. I watched her face when Voss walked through that door, and I've spent 31 years reading faces for what the body knows before the mind admits it. And I'll tell you plain, there was no flicker of recognition in her. None. Not the smallest catch of breath, not the color draining or rising, nothing a person can fake convincingly when they're standing 3 feet from a man they've known their whole life. What there was, instead, was fear. Quiet, controlled, the kind a person learns to wear like a coat when showing real fear has cost them before. "Beatrice," Voss said, and put his hand out like he meant to take her arm. She stepped back, not dramatically, just a half step, the kind that says everything without saying anything the law could write down. "I don't know you," she said. "Course you don't, you hit your head, the doc here's told the whole town that part. Don't mean I'm not your brother." "What's our mother's name?" she said. He hesitated not long, half a second, but I caught it, and so, I think, did Sheriff Dolly, who'd been a card player in his younger years and knew the tell of a man bluffing a hand he didn't have. "Eleanor," Voss said. "And my father's." "Look, this isn't. I didn't ride 2 days to get quizzed like a schoolboy." "What's our mother's name?" she said again, and there was steel in it now, something coming up through the fear like a blade through cloth. "Because if you're my brother, you'd know it without having to think on it." He didn't have an answer. Sheriff Dolly, to his credit, asked Voss to step outside with him, and I heard enough of the conversation through the window, Dolly's voice flat and unimpressed, Voss's getting louder and uglier, to understand this wasn't a brother looking for a sister. This was a man looking for something he'd lost track of and didn't much care to explain why he wanted it back. Dolly sent him off that day with a warning. He came back 4 nights later. I woke to the sound of glass. Not breaking, that would have been louder, would have woken the whole street. This was the quieter sound of a window being worked at, a blade or a knife between frame and sash, the particular scrape of somebody trying to be careful about a thing they shouldn't be doing at all. I keep a shotgun by the bed. Had for years, a habit from a different life I don't talk about much, before I was a doctor, when I was a younger man who'd done some things in the war that taught me a man should always know where his weapon is. I was up and in the hall before I'd fully thought through what I was doing, which is, I've come to understand, what real courage actually is, not the absence of fear, but the body moving before the fears had time to argue you out of it. He'd gotten the window in the back room open, the one where Sarah slept, and he had his hand around her wrist when I came through the door. She was fighting him, silent, teeth gritted, the kind of fight a person puts up when they've learned that screaming doesn't help and struggling does. I didn't shout a warning. I want that understood plain, because I think people expect a story like this to have a moment where the old doctor hollers something brave, and the villain freezes in fear of his righteous fury. That's not what happened. What happened is I came through that doorway and I hit Garrett Voss across the back of the skull, with the stock of that shotgun as hard as 63 years of arms could swing it, and he went down like a sack of grain off a wagon, and I stood over him with the barrel pointed at a spot just behind his ear, and my hands were not shaking at all. Not once, not the way they shook some mornings over coffee. Funny what steadies a man and what doesn't. Sarah was pressed against the wall, breathing hard, her wrist already bruising where his fingers had been. "You're all right," I said, not a question, a fact I was establishing for both of us. "I'm all right," she said, and I believed her, though her voice shook some saying it. I kept the gun on Voss until Dolly's deputy came at my shouting. I did shout then, once it was over, the kind of shout that brings half a street running, and they hauled him off to the jail in irons, bleeding from the scalp where I'd opened it, cursing the whole way down the street about how she belonged to him, how I had no idea what she really was, how I'd regret sticking my nose where it didn't belong. I didn't regret it. I want that on record, too. What came out over the following days, partly from Voss's own drunk-mouthed bragging once he was behind bars and partly from a telegram Dolly sent to the county 3 over, was uglier than a runaway sister story. Voss wasn't her brother. He'd never claimed to be, not to anyone who'd known him before he rode into Carver's Gulch. What he was a man who ran a particular kind of business out of a particular kind of establishment, and the woman he called Beatrice had been one of the women working under him. Against her will more often than not. And she'd run from that establishment 3 months back, and he'd been hunting her since, not out of brotherly love, but because lost property, in the way he thought of things, was property still owed to him. I won't say more on that than I have to. Some things are better left unsaid in detail, even now, even to whoever's listening to this. What I'll say is that the train fall wasn't an accident, near as we ever pieced together. She'd jumped or been pushed in a struggle, somewhere along that spur line, running from him or from somebody working for him, and the knock on her head had taken everything before that moment, and left her with nothing but a body that knew how to mix tinctures and a mind that didn't know its own name. When she heard the full account, Dolly told her himself, gentle as that gruff old lawman could manage, she sat very still for a long while at my kitchen table, and then she said, "I don't want it back." "What's that?" "My memory, whatever's in there. If that's what's waiting on the other side of it, I don't want it back." I sat down across from her. "That's not exactly how memory works far as medicine understands it. It might come back regardless of wanting." "Then I'll deal with that when it does." She looked at me, and there was something fierce in it, something that had been buried under the fear and the blankness these past weeks and was only now coming up into the light. "But I'm not going to spend my days waiting to become whoever I was. I'd rather be whoever I am now." I understood that better than I let on. A man doesn't get to 63 without losing pieces of himself too, not to a blow on the head, but to grief, to years, to a town deciding who you are before you've had a say in it. I'd spent 11 years being the old doctor, a fixture, a thing the town used and overlooked in the same breath. I knew something about wanting to be more than what other people had already decided about you. Voss went off to the territorial court to answer for what he'd done, and that should have been the end of the trouble, and in terms of trouble it was. But it wasn't the end of the talk. If anything, the talk got worse, in the particular way small towns have of taking a thing that should earn a person's sympathy and turning it instead into a stain. Hester Calloway, who I thought might soften after everything that came out, instead found new fuel. A woman who'd worked in that kind of establishment, whatever the circumstances, whatever the truth of how she came to be there, wasn't the kind of woman a respectable man kept under his roof unmarried. Wasn't the kind of woman the church ladies could receive at Sewing Circle. Wasn't the kind of woman, when you got down to the marrying age and the marrying prospects of Carver's Gulch, that any decent bachelor in town would consider for a wife, not with that history hanging off her like smoke off a fire that wasn't fully out. I heard about it from half a dozen directions before Sarah did, because that's how talk moves. The subject's always the last to hear it straight. By the time it reached her, it had teeth. She came to me one evening. I was at the desk doing the books, a task I hate and put off as long as decency allows, and she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over herself in a way that told me she'd rehearsed what she was about to say and was bracing to say it anyway. "I should leave," she said. I set the pen down. "Why's that?" "You know why. I've heard what they're saying. I won't have it land on you. You've given me a name and a roof, and you didn't have to do either, and I'm not going to repay that by ruining what's left of your standing in this town." "My standing," I said, and something came up in me that surprised me with its heat, "is that of an old man they tolerate because he can set a bone and deliver a baby. There's not a great deal left to ruin." "Don't say that." "It's true, and you know it's true. I've watched it happen, Sarah, slow over years, the day they stop saying Dr. Tar and start saying the old doctor, like there's a clock running on how much use I've still got in me. I'm not feeling sorry for myself saying it. I'm telling you because I don't think you understand what you've actually done in this house these past 2 months." She didn't say anything, just watched me waiting. "You reorganized that cabinet in a week," I said. "You've caught 2 mistakes in my dosing since you came, caught them before I made them, which means you were watching closer than I was watching myself. You sat with old Henrietta Voss's boy through his fever last month and didn't flinch once, not at the smell, not at the screaming, not at any of it, and you did it without me asking, because you saw the need and you went to it. I haven't had a partner in this work in 11 years. I haven't had a partner in this house in 11 years. And you're standing there telling me you ought to leave because of what some small minds are whispering about who you used to be, when I can tell you straight, plain, as a man who's looked at a great many people's worst days for a living, who you used to be is not who you are. I've watched who you are. I like who you are a great deal." The room was quiet after that. I hadn't planned to say all of it, certainly hadn't planned the last part, and I sat there with my own words hanging in the air, feeling like a man who jumped off something high without checking what was underneath. "You like who I am," she repeated, careful, like she wanted to make sure she'd heard it right. "I do." "Ilias," She came and sat across from me at the desk, and she took my hand, my right hand, the one that shakes worst in the mornings, and I noticed even in that moment that she'd chosen that hand on purpose, not the steady one. I have spent 2 months with no past at all. No mother's name, no town I was raised in, no first memory of anything before waking up in this house with a stranger's bandage on my head. The only history I've got is the one we've built right here, these weeks, you and me. And I'll tell you something true, since you've been so free with the truth tonight, I'd rather have these 2 months than whatever's sitting behind that wall in my head. Whoever Beatrice was, wherever she came from, I don't want her life. I want this one. I want the one where an old man with shaking hands and a shotgun came through a door for me and didn't think twice about it. I started and didn't know how to finish it. Not young, not whole, not anything she should be settling for. You're not what, she said. I'm not the kind of man a woman chooses when she's got other options. I don't have other options, Elias. I've got no name of my own, no money, no family that isn't a lie a dead man told. What I've got is what's in this room, and I am choosing it. Not because there's nothing else, because I looked, and there's nothing else I'd rather have. We were married 6 weeks later in the front room of the church, with Sheriff Dolly standing up for me since I had no kin left to ask, and Hester Calloway sitting stiff in the third pew with an expression like she'd swallowed something sour, which I took, by then, as something close to a compliment, since it meant the rest of the talk had finally exhausted itself trying to argue against a thing that was simply, plainly, happening anyway. Sarah wore a dress that had been Margaret's, taken in at the waist by Sarah's own steady hands, because there hadn't been time or money for new, and I'd worried offering it that it would feel wrong to her, a dead wife's dress on a new one. She just looked at it a long moment and said, I think she'd rather it got worn than sat in a trunk, and that was the end of my worrying about it. I don't remember the words of the ceremony the way I remember other things. I remember her hand in mine, steady, the same hand that measured laudanum without a tremor. I remember Reverend Cole's voice going on about union and devotion, and I remember thinking, with the particular clarity a man gets maybe 3 or 4 times in a whole life, that I had been wrong, all those 11 years, telling myself and everyone else that I was content. I had not been content. I had been getting by. There's a difference, and I hadn't known it until I had the other thing back in my hands. That was 4 years ago now. She never did get her memory back, not the bulk of it, flashes sometimes. A smell of bread that makes her go quiet for a minute. A tune she'll hum without knowing where she learned it, but nothing whole, nothing that pulls Beatrice back up out of the dark to argue with who she's become. The doctor in me says that's not uncommon, with a blow like the one she took. The husband in me has stopped minding either way. The cabinet's still organized her way. Better than mine ever was. We've got a partner now too, young man named Whitfield, came through 2 years back wanting to learn the trade, and I'm teaching him what I know, the way nobody ever quite got around to teaching me when I was coming up, and Sarah teaches him the rest. The parts I never had the patience for, the bedside manner, the gentleness in how you tell a frightened mother her child's fever's broken. Hester Calloway brings soup again now, on the genuine occasions, the way a neighbor does, not the way a spy does. Took her a couple years to come around, but she did, in her fashion, and I've decided that's worth more than holding a grudge over it. I still wake some mornings with my hands shaking some in the cold, an old man's hands doing an old man's work. But I'll tell you what's different now from 11 years of mornings before her. I wake up and there's a weight beside me in the bed, steady breathing. A woman who chose this, chose me. With my shaking hands and my gray hair and my 35 years of being mostly just useful to this town and nothing more. Chose it freely with her eyes open, when she could have walked any direction at all, and had nowhere worse to land than where she started. Last week she came and found me out back, splitting what I don't strictly need to split anymore now that Whitfield does most of the heavy work, but I do it anyway, because a man needs something to do with his hands that isn't sewing flesh. She stood in the doorway watching a minute before she came down the steps, and she didn't say anything, just put her arms around me from behind, her cheek against my back, the way she does sometimes when there's no occasion for it at all, just because she wants to. What's that for? I said, setting down the axe. Nothing, she said, just glad you're the one I fell into. I've turned that phrase over 100 times since. Fell into. Like it was an accident, a piece of luck, gravity doing what gravity does. Maybe it was. I've never been a man who put much stock in providence. But I'll allow that there are things in a life you don't go looking for and wouldn't have known to ask for, and you only understand afterward, holding them, how much you'd been missing them the whole time you didn't have a name for the missing. I split the rest of that wood with her still standing there, watching, not because I needed an audience, but because I liked having one liked. After all those years of being a fixture folks used and didn't really see. Being a man a good woman wanted to watch split wood on an ordinary afternoon, for no reason at all except that she liked the look of him doing it. That's the whole of it, I suppose, not a grand story. Just an old doctor and a woman with no past, building one together out of whatever good days they could make, one at a time, until there were enough of them stacked up to call it a life.